When the feds lean on social media firms to take down alleged misinformation, it turns out that's government censorship, according to the Federal Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's worth celebrating, but there are cautionary side issues. Also, it looks like we're heading into another round of debt ceiling crisis. Some say the president is constitutionally obliged to ignore any limits and spend more than the government takes in. We'll discuss these issues and more in today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hi, everyone. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, where we try to bring you an independent take on the issues of the day, keeping a careful eye on the fate of liberty. As always, I'm joined by my friend and colleague, partner in crime, Williamson Evers, head of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hello, Bill Evers. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you, Graham.
It's great to see you, and it's always fun to have these conversations with you and with our friends who join us in various ways. So let's start with the recent ruling by the panel of judges of the Fifth Circuit. This was a little bit surprising because it seemed so clear, namely that when the Biden administration leaned on Facebook and Twitter and so forth to try and take down misinformation or harmful information, that constituted a violation of the First Amendment. Have I got that right, Bill?
You do. The Biden administration tried to say, well, we have our point of view and we should be able to state our point of view, and we didn't put a gun to their head. And the social media, well, the people that were the victims of this, the people that were blocked from social media, so we're particularly talking about policies relating to the COVID epidemic and treatments and so forth, people who had different ideas on this that differed from the Biden administration. They said, no, you strong-armed them, you muscled them, you made threats of a sort, you constantly met with them, you constantly coordinated, you constantly said you're not doing enough to block these people. And by saying that and having regulatory powers, you were censoring the people. And so the courts found that this was the case.
Yeah, and during some of these issues, I had been thinking to myself, these are private companies. If they want to, limit stuff and promote stuff, shouldn't that be up to them? But it turns out that I was missing a crucial point, wasn't I?
Yes, I think the court, the court didn't say that companies couldn't edit their content and decide what they wanted to have or prioritize, but that the government couldn't lean on them and bully them and make essentially threats. So the worry that some civil libertarians have is that as this went from one level of appeal to another, some of the government agencies that were supposed to not, pressure, be in touch with the social media companies were dropped. So there's a whole string of people that certainly had the kinds of interests that might lead them to tell social media companies what to do. So they narrowed the number of companies, and the language got a little more permissive in terms of what the government could be saying or doing as it came into this newest decision. I still would call it a victory for liberty, a victory for constraining the state and confining the state to limits. But there is wiggle room. There are ways to weasel government emergency powers of various sorts into cracks in the dike, so to speak. And so the phrase eternal vigilance is the price of liberty is still true.
highly relevant.
Yes.
But one angle on this that I was thinking of is that arguably the social media firms and their monitors and whatnot might have been inclined to block this information anyway, based on their own opinions.
They might
and
have.
maybe they could have argued that, just because the Biden administration leaned on us doesn't mean we changed our views. We had those views. We wanted to block this stuff anyway. We wanted to censor these right-wing nutcakes anyways.
Well, I think it's best. There's always arguments about how to be loose or narrow and how we use words. I think it's best to use censor when we're talking about a government entity telling a private entity, private person, what they have to do. Call it editing if we're talking about, a newspaper. You send
Right.
a letter in, they shorten it, or you send an opinion piece in, and they send it back to you and say, if you don't conform to our usage and grammar rules, we're not going to run this. That's not really censorship. So, or we're not going to run your letter at all, or we're not going to run your op-ed at all. And so I think
it's their prerogative.
We just have to be. Yeah, I think it's their prerogative.
But the
state can try and commandeer
that's
the
right.
media of communication, and the court found that that's what they were doing here.
My point, I suppose, is that even if Twitter at that time, under the pre-Elon Musk version, and even if Facebook and company would have wanted to edit out this information that they didn't think was right or disagreed with, it still made a difference that the government tried to lean on them and coerce them.
Right.
So even if it turns out that the government is pushing you in the direction you already wanted to go, the government still is not free to try and do that, to control private decisions.
It's not authorized under our Constitution to do things like that. Now, there are all these countries that are putting in fake news laws, and communist and authoritarian countries all have them.
Oh,
and, some countries that have aspects of liberal democracy, of constitutional government, have also put in false news, disinformation laws that are certainly open to terrible abuse by the government. So we just have to be watchful.
Right. I think sometimes it helps people to flip the tables and just see the principle underneath. So what if the Trump administration, successfully coerced social media companies to delete or add or whatever? Then some people might say, oh, yeah, that would be terrible. Well, it's the same thing either way, right?
It's the same thing either way.
Yeah. So did you notice this piece, Bill, on Reason.com from Ilya Somin about the other case from the same panel last year? I thought this was pretty intriguing. Last year, the same court with a different panel upheld a Texas law requiring these social media firms to post material that they disapprove of.
Yes.
So this is kind of like the flip.
And this, I think, was wrongly decided. There's also a famous case where somebody wanted the Miami Herald to run a letter that they wanted, or a response to something that was in the Miami Herald. And the courts held, the U.S. Supreme Court, it got that high, held no, the proprietor gets to decide what's in his or her publication. And so I think the courts, I don't know, the courts are struggling with these new media and new technologies, and I'm hopeful that they'll get it right and have a consistent position. But I think Somin was very sound in saying, well, they got one thing right and they got the other thing wrong. He's generally sometimes he's generally a reliable commentator on constitutional law.
Yeah, I enjoy reading his stuff for sure.
So he's
Okay,
on,
so I think
he's on the Vulcan conspiracy. That's the main place to focus.
Mhm. Yeah, it really is. So I think we sorted that one out more or less. Let's talk about the pending debt ceiling showdown, which seems to be revving up once again.
Yes.
Over and over again, we have to do this, it seems, right, Bill?
Yes. So it's kind of complicated for people that don't follow this ever, with an eagle eye and an accountant's screen visor and whatever else you might have to have. Because we remember they had negotiations on some sort of debt ceiling rules that they were going to be following, and of course those rules lasted a few months, and now we have emergency supplementals, and we have aid to hurricane areas, and we must give more money to the Ukrainian government, and all these things that are sort of, well, now let's just burst the boundaries that we set before. Right. On the other hand, the Republicans, much to the distress of the Democrats in some fields, haven't spent up to that previously negotiated, or haven't put forward proposals that go up to the level. So they're treating it as a ceiling, and the Democrats are treating it as a goal, the debt ceiling, except where they want to breach it. And this is all complicated by several other things. So one is obviously the narrowness of so the House and the Senate both have to pass these things. The House is supposed to be the origin of money bills, but sometimes
it's the initiator of the money bills.
Right, but sometimes the Senate is simultaneously working on it. It's probably for time reasons not that evil, but even so, when it gets to the final form, the House has to advance it. So the House is very narrowly divided. The Democrats have a few fewer votes, or the Republicans have a few more votes than the Democrats. The Speaker took 15 ballots to get to his position, Congressman McCarthy, and he has members who believe that there should be cuts, some serious cuts, maybe some agency, either abolition. I mean, we're talking a lot of different people here, but some people certainly want radical purges, cuts targeted on certain agencies, maybe even abolition of those agencies.
And I'm pretty sympathetic to some of those arguments.
I don't want to make them sound more libertarian than they are, but this is what's going on. And it just takes a few votes where he can't command a majority. Now, he can turn to Democrats to help him, but since McCarthy has just advanced an impeachment inquiry, the Democrats are pretty irritated with him.
They're not going to bail him out.
Well, we don't know. I'm just saying they're certainly irritated. And at the same time, McCarthy faces another problem, which is a single member can essentially call his tenure into question. So they can say, we need to have a snap vote on whether you're still Speaker. And
that was the part of the deal that they made.
That was part of the deal after those 15 votes. So there's no person that has enough votes right now to supplant McCarthy, to replace McCarthy. So it would be time-consuming, it would be irritating, it would be ugly, but I don't think he's going to be replaced by anybody. Certainly not by somebody dramatically more conservative or libertarian than he is. So it's a problem at the same time, the Senate has put together a spending plan that's quite a bit, more munificent than even McCarthy wants.
Right.
And so they're barreling ahead, and when it comes to taking another look at spending on Ukraine or cutting any of these agencies, the Senate people and Leader McConnell don't really want to do that. So it's a problem. We easily could have a shutdown. Now, McCarthy his side had a pretty good idea. They took the military things and the disaster relief, and they said, let's put those through for a year. So what they're trying to do is pass 12 separate appropriation bills for the upcoming year, rather than have an omnibus thing or a continuing resolution that lasts a long time. So he wants to take, say, 3 of those, pass them for the year, and put the other ones into a continuing resolution that goes into the fall, so for a few months. And that will give the Republicans time to thrash this out. McCarthy, of course, would rather not pass something where he's importantly dependent on the Democrats, because that would add further ammunition to people that might like to oust him. Is that clear, Graham? I don't know, but that's certainly how I think
so.
See it.
But what puzzles me
is they've tried this, like this thing I just described. He hasn't been able to get that through, even though that's a pretty reasonable plan for how to address this.
But there had been a deal struck earlier this year, as I recall, that the whole thing, they would not have to revisit the debt ceiling until January of 2025. After
this was what I was talking about.
What happened to that? Yeah, well, that got upended by these crises like Ukraine and stuff, right?
Well, that's what I was talking about at the beginning, how people were confused. They thought this had been resolved, but people wanted to breach it for disaster relief, for new contingencies in Ukraine, and just generally, people in the legislature like to spend more, many times. But we do have people who, by their beliefs, by their principles, by their doctrines, by their ideology, whatever you want to call it, want to reduce government spending or reduce it in certain areas. And so that's where the fight is. The Democrats, of course, are loving that McCarthy has all these problems.
Oh, man, yeah, well, you can see why. But I mean, the underlying thing is that the national government, the federal government, spends so much more than it takes in revenue, and it makes up the difference by borrowing.
Right.
That leads to pressures to expand the money supply and drives up interest rates and so forth. If you put it to a national vote, do you want more inflation or less? People are not going to vote for more inflation. Yeah, but if you ask them, do you want the government to spend all sorts of money on this and that, they're going to say yes.
Yes, they're going to say
that. They do want all that.
They have. This is a long time paradox observed by political scientists and public opinion scholars that there's lots of people that also try to say, oh no, it's perfectly compatible, but I don't think it really is. I think that they have conflicting views, and it's possible that with more information they could figure out how to reconcile them. And
it would be possible, but it takes a lot of thinking to kind of put those pieces together. And many people, when they vote, they're just thinking in very simplistic terms. I would like to get more benefits from the government myself, and I don't want more inflation.
So we often speak of monetizing the debt, which is essentially how we get inflation. So they're printing money to kind of get themselves out of the debt or get the burden of the debt decreased and so forth. So at the same time, some people advance balanced budget amendments. Some of our presidential candidates that are out there are trying to address this. Vivek Ramaswamy wants to he wants to reorganize at least 75% of the federal government and maybe cut as well as reorganize within that. So it's not completely clear. I mean, he talks all these agencies, yes, but then it turns out not everybody's going to be fired. They're going to go to different places. But
well, it's not clear.
He has some good ideas on this, but they're very advanced ideas. Ones we like, but a columnist in the London Financial Times said his ideas were impossibly libertarian on this. On other things, he's not libertarian. But
right. Well, one of the things that arguments that's made in this context is that unless the debt limit is raised, then the president and the Treasury will have to default on previously issued, certificates of borrowing, and therefore that would further undermine the creditworthiness of the United States government. So therefore, we have to spend more money than comes in order to make sure that we pay off our debt obligations. Now, this seems to me, unless I'm missing something, to be somewhat misleading, maybe deliberately so, because debt servicing is a growing part of the federal budget, sad to say, but the amount of money coming in from taxes and other revenue sources is more than enough to service all the existing debt obligations. So what we're really talking about...
We're talking about future debt, future adding of debt obligations.
Future adding, that's what we're talking about.
And that was... Exactly. I'm not saying it was made clear to the public, but it was certainly stated during that previous so-called debt deal of some months ago. There are arguments over what would happen. I mean, I think, though, you're essentially right about this. It is about future borrowing. But, the people who are running the country, so to speak, and running our lives, they want to add more debt. I mean, they certainly don't want to just stop now, okay?
Right.
So...
And, of course, there are literal debt obligations, and then, of course, there are sort of political obligations, like to the many Social Security and other similar federal programs. They are sort of the social equivalent of debt obligations because there are anticipated...
I think we're going to be strict constructionists here and say, no.
We should be.
They're political... They're things that politicians have led people to expect.
That's right. That's the distinction I'm actually getting at. Some people fuse the two. Some people fuse them together to make their point.
You're not really even entitled to your Social Security. There's a famous case. So a guy was a Communist Party member, and he paid into Social Security his whole life. And the Congress said, well, if you're convicted under the Smith Act or something like that, that was a anti-subversion bill in the 1950s. I guess it's not enforced anymore, but I think it's still on the books. Anyway, so they said, well, you can't get Social Security. And he sued, and the courts said, right up to the Supreme Court, said, no, this is a discretionary thing on the part of the government.
Right.
It's not a contractual thing that you can enforce.
Right. It's neither a constitutional right nor an enforceable contract.
Exactly.
But fuzzing the difference between those and things which are enforceable contracts, such as debt obligations of the U.S. Treasury, fuzzing that difference is crucial to some of the arguments being made from the more progressive side. So, for example,
So there are several candidates running for president. I guess probably all the Democrats and certainly many of the Republicans, not Pence. I guess some other people that say we can't look at Medicare, we can't look at Social Security to try to make them fiscally more sound. Just leave them the way they are.
That's Donald Trump's position.
That is, and some other candidates too. But Pence is saying no, that the traditional conservative position is we have to look for savings where they can be found and look for fiscal soundness where it can be found. And it's courageous, as they say in humor programs about politics, to do that. But I think, you and I would think he's right to say that they have to be looked at.
There's an interesting argument made by, for example, the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, which is the leading progressive organization, that actually in this whole discussion of the debt ceiling, President Biden doesn't really have to pay any attention at all because he can just ignore the debt ceiling previously enacted by Congress and continue issuing new debt because of the 14th Amendment in Section 4, the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. And this is the so-called 14th Amendment trump card or nuclear option, whichever metaphor you want to use, that President Biden could invoke.
We got to be careful not to use Trump too many different ways.
Different word.
I don't think that. That has to do with some kind of. It's like a gag order against, like a bank run type bank. I don't really. To me, it's a violation of freedom of speech. I don't see if say a scholar, Jeffrey Hummel, wants to say, not only we are bankrupt, our assets, we are bankrupt. And if you were wise, you would behave accordingly. I don't think he should be punished for saying that.
Not at all. No, that'd be ridiculous.
I also don't think. I think money should not be appropriated and spent and so forth unless Congress has gone through its procedures. We have too many ways in which that kind of thing is avoided. I don't think the president should be carrying out the laws. He should not be, as a kind of king-like figure saying,
right.
England before the rise of Parliament type figure. I want to spend this, and I'm going to spend it, and I don't care what you say.
Right.
But there are serious people that believe that. I just think they're wrong.
Well, they are wrong. First of all, this section of the 14th Amendment, like most of the Constitution, has to do with what the United States as a governmental entity may do and may not do. So I think that the 14th Amendment, Section 4, means that the public debt shall not be questioned by actions of the United States government.
I think that's a good way to think about it.
Instead of by private parties. But even in this narrower sense of the meaning of it, it still doesn't do what the Progressive Committee for Change claims it does. Namely, it means that President Biden can ignore congressionally enacted debt limits and continue to take out new debt.
Right.
The 14th Amendment, Section 4
I
covers
concur with
previously issued debt cannot be reneged upon. But there's no obligation to issue new debt.
I think that's what they're trying to do. But, of course, it's a kind of, we're going out way out on a speculative limb here. But what if tomorrow President Biden said, I'm repudiating all previous debt? I don't know how the Supreme Court exactly stops him.
Well, somebody would sue, and then he would lose the case, and then there'd be a showdown.
And so he would say, kind of like President Jackson and the Indian lands controversies, he'd say, "Okay, send in your forces, Supreme Court." I certainly don't think any immediate future president is going to repudiate the debt.
Nobody wants to.
But governments have repudiated debt. It, of course, makes it much harder for them to borrow in the future.
Yes.
So that's one of the main reasons they don't do it. But it's happened. I believe the Bolsheviks repudiated the Tsarist debt. I could reach around in history and maybe think of some other cases.
Certainly.
I might be wrong. anyway, about the bullshit.
So far, President Biden has demurred on this point and has said no, he's not going to go there. But many people are saying you need to keep this.
There's also the famous coinage thing where he mints a giant coin and declares that worth something and uses that to, I don't know. This is all gimmickry.
Yes,
it's not
it
that
is.
gimmickry hasn't been used by governments in the past, but I think
that's right.
We who want to see constitutional limits, who want a regime of constitutional liberty, should not be countenancing gimmickry that runs against the checks and balances and constraining structure.
Okay, so Bill, while we're repudiating 14th Amendment gimmickry, I'm jumping to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment on a totally different subject. This is the
I have my Constitution handy here.
Okay, so do I. So according to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, nobody who has engaged in insurrection or rebellion or aided and given comfort thereto can hold an office under the United States. And so it is being argued that Donald Trump should be declared ineligible by various state ballot officials, ineligible to be put on the ballot because of what he said on January 6th, which then was followed by a riot up to the Capitol and so forth. This is getting a lot of traction in some circles. All you have to do, they say, is the various state authorities controlling the ballots have to say, hey, I'm not putting Donald Trump on the ballot because 14th Amendment Section 3, and then he can't be elected president. This strikes me as another gimmick.
That strikes me as a gimmick too. On the other hand, we want, the Constitution has a structure of federalism that gives the states a lot of authority in terms of running elections. It's not...
Which is a strength, actually, of the system.
That's right. This whole thing about Trump and his causal role, it's a little bit strange to me. I'm not claiming he wasn't reckless or didn't say some things or, didn't abstain from doing some things on January 6th that weren't wise. But first of all, the Capitol grounds were breached before he even finished his speech. Secondly, they're convicting all these people of going into the Capitol and breaching the Capitol and maybe doing various things there, including the Oath Keepers members and kind of the group itself and the Proud Boys. And these people were not under instructions from President Trump. And the prosecutors actually tried to offer plea deals to the people in these groups. Say, if you'll just say that, I'm probably exaggerating here, but they certainly actively sought to tie Trump to these two organized groups that may have been involved in the breach. The people, the people that were convicted all have defenses. Some of them said, well, we were trying to hold the crowd back. We were trying to keep it more disciplined. Whatever, the courts have found they're guilty. So, so that's one question. So how much was Trump a party, a leader of a causal actor in this event on January 6th? So I think that's doubtful, that he caused it.
Well, I think his causal role was pretty strong, but I don't think it rose to the level of criminally culpable causality.
Yeah, I think that's right. Okay, then secondly, there's a question of, was this an insurrection? So,
per the terms of the 14th Amendment.
Well, I mean, you have to, it's like any other text, any other contract, anything that you're interpreting, you want to have some idea of what the meaning was when the contract was made, when the law was passed, or the amendment to the Constitution. I think the plain black letter meaning of insurrection, it doesn't really arise here. Stanford law professor Mike McConnell, who I think is a very smart, good judgment interpreter of the Constitution, says, to him, this is not an insurrection, okay? It's a breach of property, it's an invasion of the Capitol grounds, it's trespass, it's some rioting, it's some assault and battery, maybe some theft, but it's not really an insurrection in the sense that, the South seceding from the Union was insurrection. Or maybe somebody might say Aaron Burr's activities. This could be, of course, hugely controversial, depending on how you want to see it, whether it was just Jefferson mistreating Aaron Burr. But anyway, somebody might claim that. So the point is, it doesn't really rise to that. And then the last question, to my mind, well, there's two more questions. So one more question is Trump, when he was serving as president, an officer under the Constitution? Because as you read that carefully, it says representatives, senators, people who take an oath, etc. So it seems to be everybody in the federal government lower than the president. Okay? The president has a separate oath that's found in Article 2. The language of it is specified, and so forth. And so the wording of this amendment seems to mean everybody who is lower than the president. So it's not clear that it applies, and people have written about this. And people have even changed their mind. Top scholars who originally thought, yeah, this does apply to Trump, when they heard this argument advanced about what is in the 14th Amendment, they said, oh, it doesn't really apply. So then another question is this, by the way, all these guys that have been convicted for January 6th events have not been convicted for insurrection.
Right.
They've all been convicted for the things I was describing: trespass, disorderly conduct, failure to disperse, on and on and on, the different things that are pieces of a riot and a civil disorder, and not an insurrection.
Which is so okay. You said you have a third
the last
reason
thing
why
is this self-executing? Or,
yes, that's a big question.
So the word self-executing means it's in the Constitution, and Congress doesn't have to pass a law explaining what this means and what the penalty is and what triggers you being a crime, and do you have to have intent and all these different things that might go into a statute, okay? So some people say it's self-executing, it's in there, and other people say no, you need to have a statute. Now, I forgot to mention also who is an officer. The courts have found that the president is not an officer in various case law. They could change their mind. So this is certainly going to come to the Supreme Court, because there are going to be state election officials who buy this argument and refuse to put Trump on the ballot.
Yeah, that'll trigger a suit.
It's just, I can't imagine that there won't be some guy who thinks, my historic role would be to do this, and they're just not going to be able to resist. And so somebody will do it, and it will go to the Supreme Court, and they will consider these questions that we have been talking about here.
So just to add a little bit more color, we do have something on our website, independent.org, by one of our legal experts, William Watkins, Jr., on the subject of this, on Trump and the 14th Amendment, worth looking at on our Beacon blog at independent.org. And Bill Watkins argues that it's not self-executing because at the very end of the 14th Amendment, it says that Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation, the provisions of this article. And then Congress did, in fact, enact 18 U.S. Code Section 2383, he points out, which shows that anyone who's going to be kept from office by this Section 3 of the 14th Amendment has to go through an adjudication process with procedural protections, a jury trial, the right to appeal, etc., before being found disqualified under the terms of this Section 3. So he says it's not self-executing because Congress set up the execution of the rule.
I think that makes complete sense. I think so. There's major problems with trying to do this. And the reason why it feels instinctively to us as gimmickry is that it seems bizarre that a state-level Secretary of State or whoever runs the elections in a state, and sometimes it's commissions and various things in the state, could block somebody. On the other hand, I don't really remember this exactly, but it's possible that to the extent, this is again a weird thing because in the 19th century there weren't necessarily official ballots in the states. So let's take the 1860 election, and you look at the results, and in some history books it will say Alabama or whatever state, Lincoln got no votes, or he got a negligible amount of votes, and so you think, well, what, they were so low that nobody bothered to tabulate them, whatever. So I don't know enough about that to say what exactly happened, but this will be adjudicated, and it does feel strange to us that a candidate of a major party could be kept off. Now, at the same time, think about it this way. Let's say it's Ross Perot running for president, or let's say it's Robert La Follette in the early 20th century running for president, or it's George Wallace running for president. He was not on every ballot. The states have rules which are different in each state, and so the Libertarian Party, I think it's on the ballot in all 50 states. Certainly sometimes it has been, but sometimes certainly in its early days, it wasn't on the ballot in all states. The Green Party, I'm sure, is not on in every state.
But those were ballot access decisions that were not pivoting on 14th Amendment Section 3.
Yes, but I'm just saying, if you want to say, if it's your instinct that a major candidate should be on the ballot, whatever the reason is, it's just
right.
There's different things we're talking about here. So one are the technicalities of the constitutional interpretation, and another is the gut feeling. Oh, the top candidate should be there. Well, they're not always there in every state, and so
and as we said a few minutes ago, one of the strengths of our constitutional system is the degree to which jurisdiction is devolved at the state level, and we prize that, and rightly so, because it's an impediment to consolidated tyranny and all that. So actually, that's a good point.
I was thinking about all this when we had our manhunt in Pennsylvania, the Keystone Cops in the Keystone State there, and so there are all these federal people chasing this guy, and you think to yourself, well, he's a murderer. Isn't that a state activity? Why is the federal government
I wondered that.
Well, it turns out that Pennsylvania is on the Great Lakes, and therefore it's an international boundary, and therefore, on and on. They just construe this too loosely. I mean,
right.
Attorney General Edmund Meese used to say after he was out of office that we have federalized too much of crime.
Yeah.
And
we federalized way too many things.
Yes, and so if we centralize, as certain people, certainly many progressive Democrats right now, want to centralize the election procedures and the rules. And I think then they have H.R. 1, which never passed, but Pelosi wanted to centralize the election rules, as I remember.
Right.
I have the details wrong on that, but it's not a good thing. We want to preserve autonomy for the states, but
right.
it
So
still
my thought is, right.
We don't want
My thought
we
on
don't
this,
want Arkansas forbidding Trump on the ballot or forbidding Biden on the ballot because he didn't defend state sovereignty. Therefore, he was, I don't know what, but for some crazy reason that a local secretary of state might come up with.
right. So, in general, my point would be we want to preserve, and we should want to preserve as much appropriate local jurisdiction as possible under our Constitution, which is very considerable. It's just that in this case, the gimmicky use of
they always
the 14th
say that, right?
the gimmicky use of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, fails either because it was an insurrection, or because it doesn't apply to the office of the presidency, or because Congress already enacted the procedures by which a person could be disqualified.
Which have not been followed in this case.
Which have not been. So those are three particularly
pretty strong
reasons.
Pretty strong reasons.
Yeah. And this is different, therefore, because of the enforcement aspect of the 14th Amendment. This is different from, say, the First Amendment, where some local governor or mayor declares, you can't have freedom of speech. I think a local official in that state or city or whatever would be perfectly justified in saying the First Amendment protects free speech. It's self-enforcing. I'm going to resist.
Right, which we saw in the case of the Second Amendment in New Mexico.
Which is exactly parallel to that, which we talked about in a recent
this is complicated
discussion. Yeah. I think we've navigated a little bit, and if it does come to a court decision, it'd be real interesting to see how the court's treatment of this does or doesn't track with our very preliminary discussion of it today.
Yeah. Right.
So we're getting short on time here. Bill, would you like to turn to some other political matters that you had in mind for today?
I could go through the first Republican debate, or I could
let's talk
about
briefly
how the
about
different
that.
candidates are doing. I mean, I think, the truth is it's still very early. But it's also true that Donald Trump is way ahead in the race for the Republican nomination. And it's difficult to see what will dislodge him.
Yeah, he doesn't have...
I certainly know many, many people who would prefer another candidate would run in the Democratic race and
on both
in the
sides.
Republican race.
There's such, especially on the Democratic side, the majority of Democrats apparently polled say that they would rather not have Biden run again, and yet no effective challenger has really emerged against President Biden, just as it's not clear that any of the Republican challengers to Trump has emerged in a strong position either. They both are pretty dug in their position.
Well, Newsom is certainly visiting a lot of places.
Isn't he?
Trying to get himself in the news, but he's also being very careful and saying that he endorses Biden. There's also discontent over Kamala Harris being the vice presidential candidate. And, I just, the problem, one of the dynamics of this is the more they throw what look like political indictments against President Trump, the more people are upset by that who are in the Republican constituency. So now another thing that's very interesting is how the two candidates, Trump and Biden, are, assuming Trump gets it, are doing in the states that are going to make in the Electoral College are going to make the
pivotal states.
So what's happening in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, so forth, and Arizona, and so forth. So it still looks like, many people say, oh, Trump can't win. He can't, Biden beat him last time in those states, and he's not going to pull it off. On the other hand, Trump is improving with minority voters. He's improving with younger voters. It's not clear what, many racial minority voters are concentrated in states that are already going to go for the Democratic candidate. So even if Trump is improving, it's not necessarily enough in these swing states to make him win. But I think it could go either way at this point. It's so early to just, but you have to say, if the election were held today, I think either candidate could end up the winner right now.
Yeah, that does seem to be true. Okay. I think that we will call it quits for the day and look forward to our next conversation. I'm so grateful to Bill Evers for his insightful analysis of so many of these issues. Also grateful to our friends who join us from far and near on Independent Outlook. As a reminder, you can always come to our website, independent.org, and find a lot of really useful resources on these and other topics, which are probably at even better depth than what Bill Evers and I could give you today. Any final greetings for our friends, Bill?
No, but thank you, Graham.
And thank you, Bill. And thanks, everybody, for joining us on Independent Outlook. Take care.